welcome to Dr. J's Web Tech Lectures. For this lecture, we're going to be talking about HTML and CSS fundamentals. So for some of you, this might be brand new, and for some it might be reviewed, depending on where you're coming from and what you've done. So first things first, we should talk about getting started with a particular text editor or code editor. So web text editor or code editor. You should pick one of those. Don't use Notepad++. That's kind of not maybe as powerful as we'd hope. They're okay. I mean, you could technically just use Notepad or Notepad++ or Text Wrangler or some very, very simple run-of-the-mill text editor. But I think Visual Studio Code is your best bet. This will also help you if you go on to do more complicated web development, for example, with Node.js or things like that. And there's also a lot of plugins that can help you as well. So I would strongly recommend downloading VS Code. Couple notes. Visual Studio Code is the name of a product. It's a completely free code editor, and it is not the same thing as Visual Studio, which is a full-fledged IDE generally for systems development languages. So you can download it for Windows, for Mac OS, or for a Linux distribution, Debian or Red Hat derived. It doesn't matter. They have Deb and RPM files for you if you use Linux, and it's on all three platforms. Major platform categories, I guess I should say. So if we look at the website, code.visualstudio.com, typically it's going to detect what platform you're on. So for example, for me it says download for Windows because that's the machine I'm on right now. But if I was on, say, my Ubuntu laptop or something else, it would go to a different option. So Mac OS, Windows x64 installer, or the Linux x64, you want typically the stable release. All right, so once you've got that installed, downloaded and installed, it looks pretty much like this. It's pretty empty. You might have a couple tabs that show up for welcome or something like that, but it sits very lightly on top of the file system rather than, say, Visual Studio Community Edition 2019, which will actually create a bunch of additional meta-language files or meta-information files. This is pretty bare bones. You can use it with just opening a folder, and you can create the folder inside here, or you can create it on Windows file system or whatever file system you're on. I'm going to generally refer to Windows because that's what I'm on right now, but it should be fairly simple to pick up what to do on your platform. So if I go to File, Open Folder, this is how we begin here. If I go under a folder that I've kind of designated here to hold my projects that we'll do together, I call it demo-workdir. You might call yours workdir for working directory or whatever you'd like. So I go in there, and you can even create the new folder here, or you can use Windows Explorer here. If you want to do it here as well, you can do that. That doesn't really matter which one you pick. But in here, I'll create a new folder. This will be called, we'll just call it HTML1. And then I'll click Select Folder. And it'll probably say, do you trust the authors of the file in this folder? Well, there aren't any, but you can say yes, do that. And hit the X on the welcome unless you want to change theme colors. So some people like light theme, dark theme, and high contrast, depending on what your needs are. And there's other themes as well. So a bunch of other themes. This is dark, default dark. But there's tons of themes that you can pick depending on what your preferences are. So that's totally fine. Some people like the light themes, solarized dark, red, all kinds of different themes are available. So I'll just go with the default dark. You'll notice at the top of this Visual Studio Code Explorer, there's an HTML folder designated right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put my files at the top level here when I work on these, but you can also create folders underneath, or go here and create new file, but you can also right click as well, go new file, new folder. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to open up PowerPoint here, which I had opened before. And yes, I'm aware I'm not running the slideshow, but since I switch back and forth a lot, I usually just do my lectures with the edit mode enabled and then kind of flop back and forth between the different things that I have open that I want to work with. So basic web technology, this is our first step here. So this will help us understand what is the web, what's the internet, what goes on behind the scenes a little bit, and then we'll start talking about what we actually want to do. So this obviously isn't a thorough coverage. For example, of networking, there's entire courses that do networking, entire series, and since these online lectures, I hope they benefit a number of people, but they're primarily for my students, my own students at the University of Michigan and Oakland Community College as well. But there are entire courses on networking and other types of technology. So this course, this lecture is primarily covering the basics so you get an idea of what's going on behind the scenes, and then we start talking a little bit more about, well, what's the web-specific stuff. So a network is a collection of interconnected hosts or end systems. So the hosts can be clients or servers, or sometimes act as both in like a peer-to-peer situation. And in these interactions, a client is the host that requests a service, and a server is the host that responds to the requests and provides some sort of service. So also, to keep things ordered for us in our brains, the word host might sound like a server. A lot of people have told me that they heard the word host and they thought that only applies to servers, because it kind of sounds like the person that helps you when you're at a restaurant. For example, you might call it your server or the host, even though they're different positions. People kind of associate them, so they think it's the same thing. The host and end systems, that terminology is to distinguish it from the backbone of the internet and the things that are on the internal parts of the internet rather than on the edge. So we'd say the edge of the internet consists of these hosts or end systems, like your computer that you're on right now, or your phone, or devices like that, whereas routers and the ISPs with the large routers and data centers and things like that, the actual routers and switches in those systems would be more considered part of the backbone of the network instead. So the client requests a service and the server responds. And there are different types of servers as well. So we're going to be really focused on web servers, but there's FTP servers, email servers, game servers. There's all kinds of different servers. A local area network is another term you should know. So a local area network, or a LAN, connects computers that are close to each other. This is also sometimes called an intranet. So an intranet, lowercase I, and intranet. So within a single building, for example, or two buildings that are very, very close together, they could be part of the same LAN. And they're usually under the same administration. A wide area network, on the other hand, a WAN, connects two or more LANs together over a larger disparate geographic region. So whereas a LAN may just need hardware that does basic switching, a wide area network would require routers, because these different LANs would have different IP addresses. So it needs to route between the different LANs. So it needs the IP layer, what we call the IP layer, or the network layer. So the WANs are typically owned by internet service providers or large companies. Internet service providers in our area here, around where I live, and then some of the extended areas. There's obviously Comcast, Xfinity. There's also Brightspace and Wide Open West, and a bunch of other companies that compete for your to provide you with internet service, and these are the internet service providers. AT&T would be another one. The internet is a terminology referring to the largest network of networks in the world. So where a wide area network or connected wide area networks might be considered an internet, lowercase I, the internet, we typically want to capitalize that because it's talking about the specific giant internet that is the interconnection of all the networks of the world. They are kind of defined recursively, networks are, so sometimes there's leeway into what do you consider this type of network versus that type of network, but we all pretty much have a general idea of what the internet is, right? So internet versus the web. So often the terms internet and web are used interchangeably, and sometimes in context it doesn't really matter. I browsed the web the other day versus I was searching the internet for such and such and such, even though you may have only been using the web for both of those things. It's usually excusable or understandable that you would use those terms interchangeably. But in specific terminology, when we use the internet versus the web, it's actually incorrect technically to use the terms interchangeably. You could use the internet without the web. So multiplayer gaming, you're not really in a browser. Email, communication software like Skype or Zoom or Discord, GoToMeeting, etc. Texting, and which is SMS service, and sending pictures, picture mail, MMS, and different technologies related to that. You never open a browser or use a web protocol for some of these, many of these. So the web is specifically a set of protocols and services that runs on top of the internet. So the internet enables the web to exist. But many other things, again, exist without the web. They exist on top of the internet typically, but not using the web. So web servers. Now we talked about servers and clients. But a client makes an HTTP request to a web server. So this is the specific protocol, is the HTTP or Hypertext Transfer Protocol that it makes to a web server. And then the web server responds with an HTTP response. The response often includes HTML, which we'll learn a lot about in this lecture, in this class, these classes. The language of the web. So HTML is Hypertext Markup Language. It may also include other resources such as images, videos, cascading style sheets, JavaScript files, etc. So a static page is just a coded HTML page that the web server sends directly to the client based on a request. So maybe you get index.html. That's usually the name of the home page when you go directly to a website. So if I go to umdearborn.edu or oaklandcc.edu or google.com, there's an index.html page that might be sitting there, and if it's not dynamic, it would just be an HTML page, and I would just get that HTML. So a lot of other pages, actually the ones I gave examples of, probably are dynamic. These are dynamic pages that are generated by a backend and then sent to the front end. So even though you might request something like index.php or index.asp, what's actually sent to you is an HTML file that was generated by the back end. It was actually generated on the fly, and it has special features to it. It may be very, very customized. For example, this right here, this is not like heavily customized from what you can see here, but if you saw that it does give recommendations and it shows how many items are in your cart, and here you'll notice it says, "Hello, John." This is Amazon's website, and it's customized because I'm already logged in. It knows who I am, so it knows to generate the particular page for me, and therefore content related to what I've purchased or what I'm going to purchase, what I might like, orders I've created in the past, things like that. So front-end technology is one aspect of web development that we need to know. Typically, if someone stays just in the front end, a lot of times they're referred to as web designers, especially if they cover mostly the HTML, CSS type stuff and maybe don't do as much of the JavaScript. But JavaScript is still considered a front-end technology for the most part. We'll talk about when that's different. So HTML, this provides structure for our web pages. I'll scoot that over just a tiny bit so it's not interfering with our dog over here. And we've got HTML, so that's the structure and content of the web pages. We can look at it as the nouns of the page. So dog, right? In this sentence, dog would be a noun. CSS provides formatting and design, cascading style sheet, so it provides style. And this is often the adjectives of the page, like make the heading blue, or make the title orange, make this font bigger, make the background this color, give the table this alternating color, make the article content of this article rounded corners with a certain amount of padding, things like that. These are all adjectives or descriptions and formatting and design about the HTML. So that's something like the adjective like spotted dog. So JavaScript provides the dynamic behavior and client-side interactivity. These can be seen sometimes as the verbs of the page. Okay, the verbs. So the spotted dog jumped. And here's an example here on CodePen. I'm going to do Control-click. And this is a link on CodePen. It's got some pre-made stuff that I've got here. You'll notice that I've got the content in the HTML. And normally we'd have HTML header and everything, but you don't include that on CodePen. This is really for kind of just testing out stuff. This is not going to suffice for what we're going to be doing for the majority of the time in class, but this is a good way to do test little snippets of code and things like that, and it's real easy to send to someone and show them what they're doing, what you're doing. So here we have HTML, which is like the nouns. You've got CSS, which is kind of like the adjectives, and then JavaScript, which are like the verbs, right? So here's the content. I can see that I've got a heading 1, which is where the welcome to my website comes from. And then I've got a paragraph. So it's really not many HTML elements in here, just the H1 and our P for paragraph here. This is lorem ipsum. It's just basically a segments of modified segments of Latin, right? So I believe it's Cicero. And then it shows up on the page down here. And why is the default color blue? Because over in CSS, remember, these are the adjectives, and blue and size and things like those are adjectives. So the color is blue, and the font size is 20 pixels. So that's the regular font size. And then I have this thing called H1 Special. Now, I don't have anything set to have the class H1 Special. This is called a class here with the dot. So it says any H1 that has the class Special should get the color orange and have its font size to 250% of the regular font. Now we'll see where that's used in just a second, but right now the only thing that's applied by default is the body, which is color, blue, font size 20 pixels. Now you'll notice every time I hover over here, it seems like it's doing something in response to me hovering over and then hovering off of the H1 line right here. Right? So it's going from the default blue, and then it's going to bigger font, and also to orange as well. Over here in the JavaScript, you can see why that's the case. This is JavaScript that will be automatically applied to the HTML by CodePen. We have to do a little extra work when we do this in, I'll say, real life. But you'll see that down at the bottom, I have window.addEventListener, and I have it set so that as soon as the code has loaded, the HTML, the CSS, everything has loaded, I'm going to call a function whose name is start. Notice I don't put a function call syntax here. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger, a little too big. You don't put function call syntax here, you just put the name of the function, right? So start. That's why it matches, oops, wrong way. That's why it matches start right here. So as soon as the page loads, it goes to the start function that I defined up here. And you'll notice I also have a global variable essentially right here called the H1. And I say let. That's not a data type. That just says let this thing exist. We'll get to data types and things like that as we go through more material. But we've got the H1. So it's a heading 1. And that variable means nothing at this point. It doesn't really hold anything. So I have to say the H1 equals. And then one of the ways I can grab the H1 is to say document.querySelector. And this will actually grab, since I say query selector, it'll grab the first H1, but since there's only one, it'll grab that one. There's query selector and then query selector all, and it uses actually the same exact selectors that you would use in CSS. So if I say h1.special and that already existed, we would say it would only grab h1s with the special class on them. But we want the h1. Then I add h1 add event listener. I add 2 events. The first one is for mouse over. That means when the mouse hovers over it. And then mouse out for when the mouse hovers off of it. You'll notice a couple little things here if you're coming from another language. Single quotes and double quotes both work for strings in JavaScript. And if mouse over event occurs, then hover header is going to be called. That's the function name. And then if mouse out occurs, if that event occurs, hover off is going to be called. So let's scroll down just a little bit. We see those are just the only 2 other functions here. Function hover header. All this does is it takes the h1, which is globally accessible, that since we started, we were able to grab it, so there's no danger of it holding an invalid value here, as long as we checked our names correctly. So this takes the h1, sets the attribute class to special, and then when you hover off, it removes whatever attribute is currently set as class. That's all it does. So these are special methods of the h1 class. They're functions essentially that live inside the h1 or h1 variable, and then one of the attributes we access is called class, and we say what am I setting that class attribute to. So what happens is it sets the attribute to special. So now it's not just an h1, it's an h1 with a class special. That's what the dot means, is class in CSS. So we've got dot special, and what does that mean? Well, you've got this list of rules, different styles to apply. The first one says make the color orange and make the font 250%. That's when I hover over the header, right? When I hover off of it, it removes this class. It's still an h1, but it'll go by the default color and everything that the body says. Okay, now h1s are naturally larger than the regular body font. That's why it's still bigger. But this is like the regular body font, so it basically takes it back to normal. So right here, see, when I hover over it, it turns orange. When I go off, it turns back to normal, right? Pretty cool. All right, so I recommend you get a CodePen account, start playing around with that. You actually don't need an account to play around with the code right there. You can change it if you want to, but it won't modify what I put up there, so it's really cool. Now moving on, we're going to go into the actual basic HTML, which is the hypertext markup language. Now, we talked about the internet being the foundation and the web sitting on top of that with multiple protocols that enable us to use this thing called the web, right? Now, the HTML is some of the most fundamental front-end technology. You don't have websites without HTML. They can survive without CSS and JavaScript, but HTML is really the main content and structure of your page. So let's see what we've got. So the basic workflow you're going to use if you use VS Code is, we know that VS Code sits gently on top of the file system, and you can create a folder for a project from either the Windows file system or your other OS, or from inside VS Code. And I already did that, and I actually already loaded the HTML1 file, remember? So file, I went to open folder and then burrowed down into a nice area I wanted. And you want the folder that is going to be the actual project, where you hold that single project typically is what you want. So I put it in the HTML1 folder, and moving on from that, we selected it, and then the folder into which you want to put the project files shows up, and you can work with it from there. So this just goes out and tells you how to make sure you get it right. In this example, there was the folder called workdir is what I selected, but for us, we did HTML1. Now, HTML syntax is very different from what you're probably used to if you're coming from just, say, C++ or Java or Python or C# or something like that. It's a declarative language. So it's actually, in that sense of its paradigm of languages, it's actually closer to, say, SQL, than it is C++ or Java or something like that. Because the languages like C++, Java, C#, Python, those are object-oriented, but they also derive from an imperative language paradigm. So imperative has to do with telling the language to do something. You tell it exactly what it's supposed to do. Declare this variable, loop through this, print that out, set this to that, do that, do that, do that. That's imperative. HTML is a markup language, which is a subcategory of declarative languages. So declarative languages describe, and then imperative languages instruct. So JavaScript falls more under the imperative side, whereas HTML is declarative. Okay, CSS would even fall kind of under a declarative heading as well. So HTML, if we want the basic skeleton, or what we would call maybe boilerplate code of an HTML document, it would look something like this. So you have a doc type at the very, very top here, not doc type HTML. This is technically not considered HTML, but it tells, it's a metadata. That's why the exclamation point is at the top, because it tells the browser something about this document. It tells it that this is an HTML file that adheres to current HTML standards. Then we have the HTML. You got to look at these as kind of like boxes that contain other things, but they're on their side. So think of it as the bottom of the box over here. And this HTML element is made up of two tags, an opening tag and a closing tag. And it only contains two things directly, direct children. It contains head and body. That's all it contains. That's all it's ever going to contain directly, is the head and the body. So I would recommend, just even for practice, a lot of people, get kind of, they're like, oh, don't learn by rote and memorization and things like that. Well, some of it actually helps. It's muscle memory. And I'm not saying that's the best or only way to learn, but it's part of your learning process, is doing things over and over again and then getting comfortable with typing them out. So I would say, even if you just typed this whole thing out over and over again a few times, it would help you. So again, this is a tag, the HTML opening tag, and we'll get to it in a second, but this is actually called an attribute. Lang equals en for English. That's an attribute, but the name of the tag is HTML. The name of the next tag is head. It has a closing tag with a / inside of it. Notice there's always angle braces. And then we have the body opening tag, body closing tag, and then the HTML closing tag. You don't want to overlap them. For example, I don't want body's closing tag to be overlapping HTML. That wouldn't make sense, because then it wouldn't really be inside of the HTML tag anymore. You can think of these as more like siblings, head and body, and there's maybe smaller boxes sitting next to each other inside this larger box, right? And together, these two tags, typically they're two tags, but sometimes there's certain tags in HTML that are single tags, which we'll talk about. But this is an element, the head element. This is the body element, okay, two tags. This is the HTML element. We would say that the content of the HTML element is the head element and the body element, and that both the head and the body are empty currently. They don't have any content if we're asked about content. All right, and then here is a simple example of HTML. I think I can make that a little bit bigger. There we go. And what we have here is a little more filled out. You'll see that we still have this, we still have the HTML tags, the opening and closing tags. We still have the only two things living directly inside, and usually we tab it in or do a couple more spaces to indicate that it's another level of indentation. And the indentation really doesn't do anything as far as HTML acknowledging the indentation, but it's just like Java or C# or C++. It makes it cleaner and easier to read. This doc type, sometimes you'll see it capitalized, sometimes you won't. But I do recommend don't ever capitalize any of the tag names anymore. They used to do that in the 90s, but no one really does it like that anymore. They're all lowercase. That's just kind of how it is. Now you'll see that there's, again, the head element and also the body element, which live directly inside the HTML element. Inside head, I have two elements. This, we'll go with the bottom element first. The title element right here has an opening title tag and a closing title tag. This would be what would show up. It would help search engines. It will also show up on the tab and screen readers to tell it what page it's on and things like that. So the title of this page is John Baugh is Awesome, which he is, of course. The tag above it is, you'll notice, does not have like /meta. It's just a single tag with meta as the name. And then it says char set equals UTF-8. That tells us that this particular page uses the UTF-8 text, which is normally the text that we're using in English. Also, another thing we want to add probably is lang equals en. I'm not too happy that it did these special quotes here. So actually, I'm going to show you a little trick. If I go to File, Options, and PowerPoint, so you're going to learn all kinds of stuff. And then proofing, there should be an option here, if I can find it, for, autocorrect options, sorry. Autocorrect options, there is an option under, I believe, autocorrect, capitalize, replace text as you type, auto format, we're going to find it. Smart quotes. Do you see how it says straight quotes with smart quotes? Replace as you type. I don't want that because I'm doing a lot of code, so I'm going to uncheck that. And I believe like Word and other things have a lot of similar situations with them, so you can go into the auto format as you type, uncheck smart, replace straight quotes with smart quotes. That's caused all kinds of headaches when people did copy paste with code. So now when I do it, it should, just straight quotes. So it's not trying to use smart quotes anymore. Smart quotes are really nice for copy editing and regular text documents. For programmers, it's a nightmare. So that's an easy way to get rid of it. I'd forgot to do it on this particular PowerPoint on this account, so it didn't fix it. Now we have inside of that the meta char set UTF-8. You have the HTML attribute lang equals English. Meta char set does not have a closing tag. We just call this a void element or an empty element, or sometimes you'll hear self-closing element. It used to be that it was required you put a slash there, inside the single tag, but we don't do that anymore. So HTML5 does not require it, so we don't do it. Now inside the body, that's going to be the majority of the actual content you see on the page. So right here I have H1, that has John Baugh is Awesome, that's a heading 1, and you have a paragraph here, talks about John Baugh. John Baugh is incredibly awesome, handsome, as well as very humble. Those are all true. And then the next paragraph, he has a PhD, teaches well, and is a lenient grader usually. There's a couple other tags to notice. Inside the paragraph tag, you'll notice that there's an EM tag here. Now, what does that mean? Well, the EM is for emphasis. Okay, so you're going to learn a ton of different tags over the course of learning HTML. Some of them are absolutely crucial that you know right away. EM and strong are useful ones. EM, by default, unless you use CSS to style it, will normally italicize the content. If you learned web development a long time ago, they might have told you to use I, like just the letter I for italic, and B for bold. But nowadays, since we have CSS, it's considered inappropriate for the HTML to do anything or say anything about what does this look like, and italic and bold are both statements of what does this look like. So emphasis, though, emphasis just means, hey, I don't know how you're going to do it, just emphasize this text. And strong, if you type strong, that will make the text that it is surrounding strong, whatever that means. And by default, a browser is going to make EM italic and strong bold. One other thing to note, you probably noticed it already, was this little thing right here. Now you notice it has angle braces, It doesn't have an opening, closing tag or anything like that. But inside the angle braces, it's got some special syntax. So you have the exclamation point or the bang symbol, and then hyphen hyphen. And then at the end, you just have hyphen hyphen before the close angle brace. This designates a comment in HTML. So this again goes over some of the stuff we just talked about, but just to make sure it's ingrained in us. So most HTML elements start with an opening tag and end with a closing tag. So for example, you have HTML, H1, etc. And then some have just a single tag, and they're referred to again as empty elements or void elements, sometimes self-closing elements. And it's not because they don't convey information. It's because that they can't have content in between two tags because there's only one tag. Now, for example, the image tag actually conveys quite a bit of information, but it is a void element because it does not have a close image tag. So it's img, and then it's got two attributes. In this case, src and alt. src is set to go into the images folder and find an image called dog.png, and then alt, this is the alternate text used by screen readers, and also if the image doesn't load or something happens to the image, it'll be kind of the placeholder for the image. If you hover over it, it'll say a doggy. So the alt is considered very important to include with an image. It's not technically required, but technically neither is source. It just won't do anything. But you need the source set with the image, and then always set the alt because that helps screen readers, and that helps with what we call accessibility, because people who are visually impaired, who may not be able to see the content, if they're either fully blind or just legally blind, or they just can't see certain colors real well or things like that, they might need this to help them out. So it's always a good idea to use the alt tag. In fact, even if the image is decorative, this is just kind of a side note, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more in later lectures, but as just a side note, if you have decorative images, say around the page, stuff that isn't really, hey, look at me, or hey, look at this image, it's important, or, cohesive for you to understand the page, even if it's just decorative, like flowers around the page or a gecko hanging onto something or whatever, it's still considered a good idea to put an alt tag. You just make it empty. So you put just two double quotes right next to each other, and you might think, well, why do we do that? That's kind of stupid. And it's not stupid. It is, for people who can see, this doesn't make a lot of sense to us, because we're like, well, that's stupid. It's just an empty alt tag. Well, the thing is if you don't have an alt tag at all, someone's screen reader, let's say you have 15 styling images around the border of your page to make it look real cool. Maybe you're working for Blizzard and you make the World of Warcraft webpage or something like that. That's all kinds of decorative stuff all over the place on that page, and different games and things like that. Now, if you don't put an alt tag period, if you just leave the alt tag off, it's going to actually read the entire source of the image. So the screen reader will actually say to them, images/dog.png, and then it'll keep going over every single image on every single page, unless they skip all of them. So they might have to skip through 15, 20, 30 different images before they get to content, and that's very annoying. If you leave an empty alt tag or alt attribute on an image tag, the screen reader will skip it entirely. So that's exactly what you want, because it doesn't do the visually impaired person any good to have these, little ornaments all over the page anyway, and it's not cohesive to them understanding what's going on the page. So putting that empty tag is actually a blessing for them. So some important basic elements. This is kind of reviewing and going over some things that you should remember. And also, if you haven't learned HTML real well yet, or haven't learned it at all, these are important for you to learn these going forward. And some of these we haven't really gone over yet. But obviously you need the HTML skeleton tag. So you need the doc type. That's absolutely required. If you don't put it on there, the browser will read the page and it will, pretty much do what it should do. But it's considered incredibly sloppy, and it is not considered a valid web page unless you have the doc type at the top. For my own students, if you're watching this, if you're not my student, you don't have to worry about it as much. But if you are my students, I will. If you don't put the doc type at the top, you're going to get like 50% off. Just, it's so simple to do, and you need to do it. Always have it. Even if you're in a course I'm teaching that's just JavaScript focused, you still have to use good HTML practice, okay? So always put the doc type. Also, it's important that you put the HTML tag, head tag, and body tag inside those. And the HTML tag should at least have lang equals en. Some people would also put dir, like they'd put inside, well, here, we'll do it here. They'd put direction equals LTR. So that says direction of the text in English is to be read left to right. That helps screen readers and other some certain browsers and things like that work as well. You can leave that if you'd like. I don't always use it, but it's also a good idea to have that. Tags for HTML head inside the head of the inside the head, which is inside the HTML. You have meta char set that should go in there regardless, and so should some sort of title. Okay. Other useful tags that go inside the body that you should be aware of. Once you've got the skeleton down and you kind of know how that works, maybe type it out 10, 15 times, make sure it's part of your muscle memory or gets part of your muscle memory over time. For images, you need img tag, and you want the source and the alt attributes inside there with values. You also want headings, H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. It goes down all the way to H6. If you try to go any lower than that, it'll just render like an H6. So if you try like H24, it'll do H6. But most people don't even generally go down to even H6. So H1, H2, H3, you're kind of pushing it by H4. H5 is a little ridiculous, and H6 is just, it's rare when you see those. Generally, a rule, it's not a rule, a hard and fast rule, but a rule of thumb is you should have one H1 on a web page, and then the H2 should be like the header. So if I'm in Microsoft Word, I might put title and then put my headings as H1, my top level headings, and then H2's under those. But in a web page, typically the quote title on the actual body, obviously it's not the title because that goes in the head, but there's no title tag for the body, we would use the H1. And you would generally want to keep just one of those. But that's not, again, a hard and fast rule. It doesn't mean that there aren't good designers and good developers that don't do that, but that's considered a pretty good rule of thumb. Another tag that you should definitely be aware of is the anchor tag. This one does actually have, I should have put, this is not really a good thing to type between them, but it does have a closing A tag. So A stands for anchor. And that basically says to go to another page. And this would be an example of an anchor tag that takes you to Google. Okay, and that's done by the attribute href, hypertext reference. Okay, you put that in there, and when this will automatically, by default, the styling is that the web page will underline, the browser will underline, click here, and you would click it, and it would go to the page specified in href. Other important basic elements that you should be aware of are ordered lists, which are like bullet points, and also unordered lists, which are like bullet points, and ordered lists, which are numbered lists. Okay, so they both use li items. You'll notice that, but when I have ul here, that means it's an unordered list. So all of the li's inside of it will be unordered. They'll just be bullet points. Whereas in the ordered list, this will, by default, it'll be 1 and then 2. And then there's also attributes and styles and stuff that you can apply to these to make them like Roman numerals or different, these could use different symbols instead of plain bullets. Maybe you want a star or a horse or something like that. There's all ways to do that, but that's done with CSS. All right. And speaking of CSS, moving up next, just a basic introduction to CSS. And again, this lecture is just to get your feet wet. It is not considered comprehensive. If you follow additional lectures as we go along and you're taking an HTML or CSS or web design course with me, or you're reading a book on it, you should learn more in-depth stuff about CSS and HTML. But for right now, we're just getting our feet wet and seeing kind of what they do and what they look like. So basic CSS, whereas HTML gives the overall form, basic structure, and content of a web page, cascading style sheets provides formatting and design. So cascading style sheets can be three major types. Inline, which is frowned upon generally because that's almost as bad as just putting the style directly on the element, which it kind of is. This isn't used as much if you can avoid it. Sometimes it's useful, but style equals, and then in these double quotes, you'll have kind of like one of the styles I showed you earlier with a semicolon and everything. You put the CSS in between these double quotes. So this would make the font size of the H1 150%. Embedded CSS means it's directly inside the HTML document, inside of style tags. So that would be inside the head element. So if we're on slide 17, if we go up just a little bit, if I went down to our example here and I put a set of, I'm going to get rid of these in just a second, but if I put a set of style tags right there, and then I put something like, body, and then decided, hey, I'm going to put, the color means font color by default. So we'll just say color red or something like that. That would be an embedded style sheet. Okay, so that's embedded styles. All right, back to 17. And then the one that you want to use the most is typically going to be the external style sheet, because then if you want to update something for multiple pages and they're all pointing to that external style sheet, then it's much easier to maintain. So we want to make our lives as easy as possible. External style sheets are a really good way to do that. Now, embedded style sheets are still used, so are inline. Inline aren't, you really want to avoid inline if you can, but embedded are used quite frequently to do little tweaks to certain pages that need it. But external style sheets are by far the most preferred if you can do it. So connected in the head element to the HTML, so the HTML has to actually refer to the CSS in order for it to work. So for example, this tag right here, this element, again, it's a void element, doesn't have a closing link tag. So it just says link, and it has two attributes that you need to use. It's rel equals style sheet, and then you put href, just like we did for the anchor tag, href, but you're going to refer to a CSS file. So if you have a folder, if I'm in the, say, a HTML file called index.html, and then one of its sibling things that lives in the same folder as index is a folder called styles, and then in that folder is main.css, this will link the CSS to the head, or in the head to the HTML. And here's an example of basic CSS. So CSS consists of style rules. Each rule starts with a selector. So body, this right here is a rule that has a selector at the top called body. This one, H1, is a selector as well. This right here is a class selector on an element named big perps for making something purple, for example. And then H2, this right here, any H2 will have this color. This time a hex value is used for the color. Up here, a name is used. There are some names for colors that can be used in CSS. And then the third way to do it is to use RGB function in CSS. And this one has the red, green, and blue values. Down here, in the hex value, this is more common. We have red, green, and blue right there. So that tells you the amount of red, green, and blue. Okay, so the selector is followed by a set of curly braces, and then inside the curly braces are different rules or declarations. So this would be one declaration. Color is blue, and it has a colon. You'll notice not an equal sign. This one says the background color is this RGB 232, 246, 243. And then H1 is a selector with a set, and it has a list of declarations or rules. Color is orange. Color font size is 250%. And if you break down the declaration or rule into parts, this is called a property, so color property, and then orange is just called the value of that property. Cool. So now examples and exercises. All right, so examples and exercises. Now what we're going to do is we'll go over a single example first. So create a subfolder under the whatever working directory you're in called example1, and then create a styles and images subfolder under that. So I'm going to go into my Visual Studio Code. I'm going to create a folder called example1, and you notice this collapses right here if I need it to, and then this does too. And inside example, I'm going to create a folder called styles, and also one called, I believe it was images, right? So images, yeah, images subfolder. So I'm going to right click there, do a new folder called images right there. And now find a couple images of dogs of different breeds and make sure to include the source and alt attributes. So let's find a couple dogs and put them in the images directory. So I'm just going to go to Google here and I'll find, let me see here, maybe I can find a beagle image or something like that that's not too big. It's not bad. How big is this? That's not too bad. 460 by 290. I'm going to save that image as. Obviously, you've got to be more careful if you're doing a commercial website or something like that. You don't want to just steal people's images, but make sure they're royalty free and charge free, or purchase them from a site of some sort, reputable site. If I go into here and then go into my demo work there, HTML1, example1, and then I'm going to put it in images, and I'm just going to call this one Beagle, and it's going to be beagle.jpg because it's a JPEG. And then in addition to Beagle, let's say, what's another? Maybe, Dachshund. So there we go. I wonder how big that is. That's a pretty big picture. I don't want that one. That one's pretty big too. I could adjust this in the search parameters, I suppose. I might have to in a second. Let me see here if I can find one that's not ridiculously huge. These are really, really big. Really big dachshund pictures. For such a small dog, such big pictures. Okay. Well, oh, that's a big dog. Okay. Let me see if I can adjust the search parameters a little bit under tools and then size. Let's see what it considers medium. These are the huge ones again, I think. Yeah, 800 by 600 is not what I'd consider medium for what I'd need. Icon sizes are going to be much smaller. That's not too bad. That's not a dachshund. A dachshund beagle? That's weird. Okay. Now there's a cute one. Okay, we'll take this one. So I'm going to right click and go to Save Image As, and I'm just going to call this one dachshund.jpg. Okay. If you want to pick a dog whose name is not so difficult to spell, that's totally fine. It's up to you. You're not turning this in. We're going to include a single H1 heading for the page called About Dog. So by default, if I don't specify, typically at the example level, I'm going to create a new file called index.html. And I'm going to, let's do this here. We need to definitely make this font size larger. So in Visual Studio, you'll also learn a lot about Visual Studio Code this semester too, I suppose. Over in the corner, Manage, and then go to probably Settings. And okay, font size for it says controls the font size in pixels in the editor. We'll see if this is right. Maybe 20. And then we'll hit X and see if that's bigger. Yeah, that's better. That's a little better. Doc type HTML. And then we have HTML lang equals English, right? And this one, Visual Studio Code, will actually match the tags that have mates. So head, and then we're also going to create body. That is usually how I start as well. I'll just create the head and the body and give it the skeleton. I'm hitting tab and it's automatically going to the right layer. Char set equals UTF hyphen 8. Okay, and then title doggies. And then what does it say to do? So heading 1 should say about dogs, and then include heading 2 for each breed, is what it says. So heading 1, about dogs, and then a heading 2 for each breed, beagles, and then another heading 2 down here called dachshunds. And then it'll say include a paragraph or 2 about each breed. Now I'm just going to put kind of some junk information, but the point is that you get a paragraph. Lorem ipsum, and we don't want that. Let me see here. Where is the... Yeah, you notice there's view word wrap. I'm going to actually use view word wrap. This is going to keep it a little bit nicer. If you just type lorem and then hit tab, it'll automatically provide you with some dummy data that you can use. I think if we do lorem times 5 and hit tab, it'll do it 5 times. So that should give you a really good idea of what we can do here. The other thing is, I have another paragraph down here. If I, let me see here. Yeah, so the other thing you can do, if you're interested in Visual Studio Code, is if you have 2 or 3 or multiple places that you need to type the same thing or paste the same thing, I've got the insertion point right here, but you notice if you hold down Alt on the keyboard, on Windows, I don't know if it's Alt, it may be Options key or something else on Mac, but if I hold down Alt and click in 2 different spots, it'll actually let me type the same thing, okay, in 2 different places, right? So I can say lorem times 5, and it's going to put the lorem ipsum 5 times in both sections, right? Pretty cool. What else do we have? Well, let's see here. Use an external CSS file. Well, before we do that, I'm actually going to test to make sure we actually see something. So HTML example 1, I'm going to double click on index.html, which by default on my system is opening with Chrome. And you'll notice it's not real pretty, but it does have the content that we asked for, right? So it's got the H1. You'll notice it's got the title in the corner at the very, very top. On the tab it says doggies. That's what I put as the title. It's got about dogs, beagles, dachshunds, and then the lorem ipsums in there. Okay, I'm going to close that. You could just leave it open and refresh, but I'm going to close it. Use an external CSS file and include it. So we're calling it dogs.css. I'm going to do that. So under styles this time, under styles, I'm going to right click new file. I'm going to call it dogs.css. And before I even add anything to it, I'm going to link it. So up here in the head of the HTML file, put link rel equals style sheet, href equals, and you'll notice the index is actually under example, right? So to tell it go into the folder called styles and then look at the dogs.css, I have to tell it styles first and then dogs.css. Okay, you can't just say dogs.css unless the CSS file lives at the same level underneath example 1 as a direct child as index.html is, and it's not. Okay, so I've got this, and now those are linked. So now in the CSS, what does it tell me to do? It says background color, set it to light beige. H1, set the color to a dark green and dark blue for H2. Let's do those 2 first, and then we'll come back to the body background color in just a minute, because that's a little different. Not too bad. H1 and then H2. So for the H1, what do I want to do? It says set the color to a dark green. Okay, so let's say the text color is there one called dark green? There is. So we can use that. Now some of the colors are named and some of them are not. So you have to kind of decide what you want to do. So dark blue for the color for that, dark blue. And then H1 is, it says the color is light, there's no light beige. Okay, there's a beige, so that should probably work. But let's say I wanted to be a little more creative. You can actually look for a color wheel, which I think I talk about a little bit later. But let's say let's say web color picker, and we'll say maybe theme. And there's several of them. Adobe has one. There's all different ones that you can check on. So if you go to like Adobe, it'll it'll give you, for example, analogous, a monochromatic scheme, triad scheme based on the initial color you give it, and you could actually give it a color here in hex. So if I want it to be, if I know that the color is fully red, like fully red, it'll give you the triads that belong to it, and you can experiment with it this way. Okay, and then you could just use any of these. So if I like this, if I find a dark blue that I like really well, and I like this better than the one that they've got, I'm going to copy that hex value right there, which is like 2C2CA3, go back into my code, and instead of maybe that dark blue, maybe I want that dark blue. It's darker or lighter. And then you'll notice also Visual Studio Code actually has a nice little widget that pops up, and I can actually let it pop up, and I can actually pick really dark colors or change the color entirely, whatever I want to do. So it's really, really cool. So I'm going to go really, really dark on that. There you go. Pretty cool. Now, if I look at the page now, if it's linked in properly with the CSS, it should style it. And it seems to. This is really, really hard to read, right? So it's making the font, oh, I know what I did. That was supposed to be the background color, right? That's not supposed to be the font color. Okay, I wasn't thinking. So that should be the background color. So color does font color. Background hyphen, you can use hyphens in CSS because we're not doing math. Background color will be beige. Now let's see what happens this time. It's probably going to look much nicer. Yeah, that's better. So this is kind of hard to tell. This is green clearly. This is a dark blue, even though it's a little bit more difficult to tell. If you want to change it, you can change it to make it easier. So if I go back to, say, the color picker, and I like, maybe find a scheme that works better, or actually I could use even just this one right here, and make it a, make it a light blue, maybe like that. Let's see if I save that, Control S, you'll notice, here, let me show you. Do you see how there's a little white circle next to the name of the file? That indicates if there was a something changed, but it hasn't been saved yet. So I'm doing Control S, and that will save it, and the little white circle goes away. So just keep that in mind. If you're like, this isn't working, it's not changing the way I changed it, maybe you didn't save it. Okay, this is much better. So it's got the beige background. This is kind of a nice little kind of silky cornstalky blue, and then it's got the default font color for regular font, which is just black. That's the default. But we could, of course, change that in body if we wanted to. Pretty cool. So another thing, if you want to experiment and extend your knowledge, I want you to find out how to make the default font family of the page and set it to Garamond, and you would do that with CSS. And another thing is you want to maybe try to use the validator at the World Wide Web Consortium, which we'll do here. And we'll do direct input, so I'm just going to copy paste it. If we go in here, and we don't care about the CSS for the this validator, at least. So I pasted it and check it, and it should tell me, is there a problem or something that it doesn't like? It'll say, document appears to be lorem ipsum text, but the HTML says language is English. So that's actually kind of funny, because it recognizes that the language is basically Latin or an unknown language or something like that. So that's just a warning it's giving me because of lorem ipsum. But if I changed it to regular English sentences, it wouldn't have a problem with it, and it would say, "Hey, validated," you know. So that's pretty cool. All right, so that's pretty much what I've got for you this time. I do want you to consider doing this exercise, making sure that you're comfortable with it. You could use the, instead of Adobe, I actually set up the canva.com, or I didn't set it up, but I pasted the link to the canva.com color wheel, which helps. And this will tell you instructions making an About Cats website. So it will involve a couple different cat breeds, but the colors and things like that and the different things I expect from it are different. So see if you can work on that and see if you can get the font to change. Same thing. Can you get the font to go to Garamond? So just do that on your own. If you have any questions or anything, and you're in one of my classes, please let me know. And hopefully this was useful for you. Other useful resources that you might consider using to help you out are W3 Schools. I know some people kind of laugh at W3 Schools as they get more advanced. They're like, oh, that's kind of silly. But W3 Schools actually has a lot of good material on it for many, many different languages and technologies. Developer.mozilla.org has all kinds of stuff related to web development, including HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And freecodecamp.org is also very, very good. I would highly recommend signing up for freecodecamp.org. Even if you're not doing something for a graded assignment, they actually have these little micro certifications that you can get for spending, they estimate 300 hours for every micro certification, but it basically goes into very, very intense detail of different aspects. For example, responsive web design is their first one. Then there's one on JavaScript. They've got stuff on like microservices. They've got stuff on frameworks and data science with Python. I think it's data science and machine learning with Python. They got all kinds of different micro certifications you can have. There's not like hundreds. There's like maybe, I think there's under 10, but they're all very, very well done. Okay, and Free Code Camp just has a lot of extra information, even if you don't go for the little micro certifications. All right, so that's what I've got for you. I hope this was useful, and I will see you next time. Have a great day.